When I was around 10 years old, I went to my friend's birthday party. I don't remember a lot of it. I didn't know any of the other girls there, and I was pretty awkward. But at the end of the day, when it was getting too dark and cold to play outside, we all went to my friend's bedroom. We all sat in a little circle in her bed, and she told us we were going to play a new game. We would all take turns telling the scariest story we could think of, and the best one would win. I don't think there is a winner. There is an apparent lack of any judging or moderation at all, but I remember those stories. I remember them for being strange and unexpected, and for holding that kind of childhood self-indulgence. One girl told us a story about a mother and her young son, and how they moved into a haunted mansion, and how in the middle of the night, blood would always pour from the ceiling. There was never an explanation. It didn't make any sort of sense, but I remember it. I also remember my story. There is a woman going on a camping trip up in the mountains, and she would always wake up in the middle of the night, and she'd see these animals standing on their hind legs, walking around like people. It sounds sort of silly now, but that image of animals with these disconcerting, far too human behaviors are actually pretty scary in the right context, at least for me. It was like I already subconsciously knew about the uncanny valley effect and how anthropomorphization can be more unsettling than anything. Actually, that story stuck with me to such a degree that a couple years later, when I stayed in a rental house out in the forest for a few days with my family, it kept me up at night. I was sleeping in this room on the second floor, and my bed was surrounded by all these huge floor-to-ceiling windows, and I could see out into the woods every night as I was trying to fall asleep, and I had this irrational fear that I might see some animal standing upright and looking at me through those windows, and that terrified me. I was so scared by my own story, something I made up when I was 10 years old. But I think everyone has a memory like that. When we're kids, we go through this phase of wanting to be scared and wanting to make each other scared. We loved campfire ghost stories. That's a part of everyone's childhood in some form or another. And for our whole lives after, we remember those stories. But why is that? And why can we spend a whole year watching all of the newest Netflix horror movies, and we only end up remembering 2 or 3. And it really makes you wonder what kind of damage commercialization is doing to modern horror and its memorability. I would argue that there are 2 major genres of cheap, mass-produced modern horror. There's that cash-grab mainstream cinema horror, and then there's internet horror, specifically internet literary horror. Both genres are infamous for being very, very bad and not very scary, but there's no doubt that the things we read online have a unique way of sticking in our brains, just like those terrible campfire ghost stories we used to tell. So the term copypasta was first used on forums back in 2006 to refer to any block of text that was widely copied and pasted to be spread around the internet. It was normally in the form of textual memes or song lyrics, or just generally something funny and annoying to clog comment sections and message boards. But in a couple years, a new genre emerged. The word creepypasta was used to refer to written internet urban legends. I think it got lumped in with copypastas because of the haunted chainmail phenomenon in the mid-2000s, when you'd be prompted to send a spam email to 10 of your friends or be cursed with bad luck for 7 years. Just like chainmail and the campfire ghost stories of our youth, creepypastas were always written as if they were factual. They were casual accounts of suppressed memories or bizarre stories from a friend of a friend. This added a cheesy, unique sort of charm to them. They quickly developed a massive fan base. And now it's time for me to link all this back to what I was talking about at the beginning, because I think creepypastas are exactly the same as childhood campfire ghost stories. If you're young enough, maybe there was even a real overlap. And I think the reason for this is definitely that sense of childlike indulgence. But here's the thing, that's what makes them scary, and that's what makes them memorable. There are lots and lots of reasons why creepypastas are usually pretty bad, but that's not one of them. If you're familiar with creepypastas, then you know that most of them tend to rely pretty heavily on scary images, and I'll definitely get to that later, but I want to spend some time focusing on the stories themselves right now. Personally, I love Candle Cove. I think it's one of the better creepypastas out there, and I want to put a little spoiler warning here because it's definitely worth reading for yourself. I'm not talking about the spin-offs or the fan-animated show. I'm talking about the real original story, published on Ichor Falls in 2009. So here's a little summary. It's formatted like a fake message board conversation between users on some forum. Someone's trying to remember a weird little show they used to watch as a kid called Candle Cove. People start piecing together old memories, and as they continue talking, their memories of it get darker and more disturbing. In the final post, it's revealed that when one of the users had watched Candle Cove as a child, they had just been sitting in front of static on their TV. So here's what I mean by self-indulgence. I think fear is ultimately governed by psychological principles, and most of them are rooted in our childhood. That's when our fear is tangible. And that's something that mainstream horror cinema is never going to capture. They have a few old, tired, psychological tropes. They know that because of our natural paternal instinct, we'll be scared of evil children. So the little girl is always going to be possessed, and the little boy is always going to be the devil. And it's so tired and so predictable. But let's let a kid tell a story. Let's let them talk about why they're so scared of that pirate puppet in their favorite Saturday morning cartoon. Because yeah, you can boil fear down to these easy, reusable psychological principles, but why overanalyze that? We were kids. We know what scares us, even if it's stupid. Let's go for it. Let's be crazy. Also, there's that twist. That big reveal at the end. There are lots of horror movies that do this, but they never do it well. It's always so formulaic. Remember when we were making up stories as kids and we didn't know how to end them, and we just made up something that didn't make any kind of sense and we never explained it? And that was okay, because you're not supposed to think too hard about it. It's like a weird nightmare or childhood memory. It's irrational and over the top and makes no sense, and that's why it's scary, and that's what the ending of Candle Cove reminds me of. When I was young, I had this great idea for a horror movie. There would be a giant mutated bacteria that would grow to be the size of a building, and then it would go around and eat people or something. I wanted to flesh out this cinematically genius plot, so I asked my mother what the story of a horror movie usually was. She told me that there was normally a group of main characters and an evil monster, entity, or person that causes a lot of destruction, and then in the end someone survives. And I didn't know it at the time because I was 8 years old, but my mother had just explained to me the premise of every horror movie that had ever been made. And it's really funny to me, because one of the main arguments against creepypastas is that it's a market oversaturated by shameless ripoffs. There are hundreds of haunted video game creepypastas and lost episode creepypastas, for example. And that's understandable, because a lot of them are written by kids, for whom other creepypastas are their only real exposure to the horror genre. The whole idea stems from retelling, from copying and pasting. But it's so sad that I even have to make this comparison. I bet it really took you a minute to think of a horror movie that didn't follow that exact formula my mother explained to me. And yes, there's lots of unoriginality in the creepypasta genre, but there's also this incredible creativity that you're not going to find in mainstream horror movies. And it's important to remember what I'm comparing. These are movies written and directed by professionals with budgets of millions of dollars, and some online scary stories mostly written by young, inexperienced internet users. Horror movies and creepypastas almost have opposite issues. Horror movies use all those technical, cheap little fear factors to make you all tense and jumpy while you're watching, but you never really remember it afterwards. Creepypastas usually have pretty bad writing, which disrupts the experience of actually reading it, but you remember them, because they're weird and unique, and that's what's important, because real fear is something your mind creates, and it's about what your imagination does with those ideas after the fact, in times when you're more susceptible to your own thoughts and paranoia. I think it's safe to say that we don't normally celebrate either creepypastas or horror movies for their stellar writing. Obviously, one of the main strengths of a movie is that it's, well, visual. They get to add creepy monster designs and jump scares, and all those fun movie things that you can do so much with. Creepypastas, by definition, are blocks of text. But if you're familiar with these stories at all, then you understand that they are not going to let that stop them from using visuals. Also, quick side note, although I'll be talking about famous creepypasta images, I won't be showing any of them. As I'll discuss, a lot of them are actually super scary and effective, and can be pretty anxiety-provoking. If you're curious and you haven't seen them before, they're easy to find on Google. Anyways, as I said at the beginning, the birthplace of creepypastas was in chainmail. Oftentimes the chainmail would have a picture. It would be a poorly photoshopped ghost or something like that, and the picture would apparently be cursed, and the only way to break the curse would be to forward the image to 10 of your poor, unsuspecting relatives on Facebook. But honestly, horror stories barely ever progressed past this point. A lot of the most famous ones are known pretty much exclusively for their images. And I find it so fascinating how incredibly these pictures work. Most of them are distorted versions of people or normal things. They're made to look slightly wrong. This triggers the uncanny valley, which is a psychological effect showing that we're most scared of the things that look closest to being human but just slightly off. Think mannequins or zombies. It actually comes from the fear of disease. For some reason, creepypastas are so much better at this than horror movies. It's embarrassing how outperformed Hollywood is. I think the time of animatronics was definitely the golden age for scary movie imagery. They were a lot more daring in some ways. People were being bold and crazy and weird. They were trying new stuff, and I really respect that. I think that should be your goal in horror. Take 1982's The Thing, for example, and how out there it was. It used shock value horror, but it also used the uncanny valley, with huge and elaborate animatronics. It was also a movie that took time and care. The man behind those animatronics, Rob Bottin, overworked himself to the point of injury on it. Of course, the uncanny valley was also often unintentionally achieved, since animatronics can never look natural. All those old horror movies had so much jerky movement and weird textures, and that was super effective too. But technology made everything worse. It's easy to slap a half-rendered CGI monster on your movie and call it a day. None of the same care was put into it anymore. With animatronics, you can tell that it's a real moving object, something that takes up space, and yet is so unnatural that it becomes very unnerving. With CGI, you can tell that it's CGI, and that's it. There's also just a general lack of creativity in today's horror movies. As I was saying in the storytelling segment, they tend to reuse old, reliable tropes, which, however effective they may once have been, just means they're not scary anymore. There's a lot of creepy ghost girls, because The Exorcist worked and The Ring worked. There's a lot of big, black, shiny monsters, because Alien worked. and nobody has the motivation to be creative anymore. Nobody in that industry really seems to care because it'll still make money. But let's get back to creepypastas. The images included in these stories, although they're simple, show a much better understanding of horror and achieving the uncanny valley, probably because the scariest images are actually the most simple to create. It just takes a little distortion on a photo of someone's face or something mundane and it becomes very disconcerting. Creepypasta images are all simple. The image from the Russian sleep experiment is just a black and white picture of a Halloween decoration. The image from Jeff the Killer is just an overexposed human face with a photoshopped mouth and eyes. The image from Smile Dog, one of the most infamous chainmail posts, is just a dog photoshopped to have human teeth. And honestly, that one kind of reminds me of my old story. Human features on animals are super creepy. They're simple, and they were probably really easy to make. And it's that simplicity and also the genuine fear they induce that makes them more memorable than most every horror movie design. If you've been on the internet for a while, you know those pictures by heart. They really take me back to the things I was scared of as a kid. When you're young, you're more susceptible to the fear of the familiar. It's that stage in your life where you're beginning to really recognize faces and figure out who you should trust. I think a kid isn't going to care so much about typical monsters or ghosts. I think those distorted faces are going to be what scares them. It's that sort of stuff that shows up in your childhood nightmares and sticks with you your whole life. And again, that's what horror should be tapping into. But I've got to be honest for a second. I can defend creepypastas as much as I want, but the truth is that the majority of them, especially the ones famous for their images, have really bad stories. A lot of it is just inexperience or a lack of creativity. Also, here's something I've noticed about the ones with pictures. You see the picture before you ever read the story, and usually the story was written as an afterthought. Since the pictures are so good, the poorly written, trope-heavy story is just a disappointment. Jeff the Killer, however famous and frightening the picture may be, is widely mocked on the internet for having a ridiculously terrible story, so bad that it almost ruins the fear factor of the image. But there are always exceptions. That's what's wonderful about the internet. I think it's so effective when the story hides the image until the very end. This is beautifully achieved by my favorite online scary story right now, CSP 1875. So, a little background. Secure, Contain, Protect, also known as CSP, is a collaborative online project taking place on the CSP Foundation, or www.cspwiki.com. The CSP Foundation is a fictional containment and research facility focused on bizarre and often dangerous creatures, forces, objects, or natural events. Each of the thousands of stories within the website are written in the style of scientific data entries. This makes the stories blunt, straight to the point, and horrifically detailed, while managing to stay interesting, and avoiding the gaudy and overused tropes of normal creepypastas. In short, the CSP Foundation fully utilizes the fact that it's all in writing, and adds that unique scare factor that a movie is never going to replicate. The CSP Foundation is also famous for having entries with both scary stories and scary images. For time's sake, I won't be going into detail on a lot of these, but they include CSP 173, CSP 106, and CSP 610 if you want to get a general idea. But in my opinion, they all pale in comparison to CSP 1875. And here's another spoiler warning, because if you're into that sort of thing, this story is absolutely worth the read, and is most enjoyable if you go into it blind. Alright, so CSP 1875, or the Antique Chess Computer, starts off rather dull. It's not exciting, or graphic, or all that fantastical. It's a description of a Victorian-era chess set, with pieces that move on their own. As the entry goes on, it explains how the set may be linked to the disappearance of the two twin daughters of a chess champion. It then recounts how, after personnel played a game of chess with the set, a strange image was mysteriously sent to all computers in the facility, a very warped and distorted picture of what is presumed to be the missing girls, one which caused anxiety and physical symptoms in all who saw it. The CSP entries offer clickable addendums attached to the page. These replicate scientific footnotes, updates, and external documents, and it's in these addendums that CSP 1875 ends. The first addendums are normal and informational, offering further testimony and documentation, but the files begin to appear corrupted, with misplaced words and scrambled text. This is when you start to pace yourself. You're the one scrolling. You're the one clicking. The CSP pages are so full of technical writing and numerical data, you tend to skim them anyways sometimes. You get impatient and you scroll faster, and as the addendums become corrupted, you're just desperate to get to the bottom. But on the last addendum, after a wall of text reading uploading over and over again, you get jump scared. The image, the distorted photograph of the two girls, is at the bottom of the page. And with your scrolling speed, you've just set your own pace for the jump scare. You've set yourself up. And CSP 1875 always impresses me, because it's a story that could never have been told anywhere else. Creepypastas give us an entirely new method of storytelling, and I really hope the uniqueness of this genre is something that will be tapped into more, because I think and I hope that sort of thing is the future of horror. Also, very briefly, there's definitely an argument the CSP Foundation stories should not be classified as creepypastas, since they're in such a different format. Personally, I disagree. I think they fit all the qualifications for being creepypastas. They're scary stories told in blocks of text on the internet, and they're written as if they are factual accounts. And since CSPs are a bit of an online cultural phenomenon, they've been passed around a lot, so this counts. So that's my defense of creepypastas. That's my defense of a genre that I think should be taken more seriously. Because while we're being flooded with new information and imagery and trends every day, we still remember those stories. We remember them so well, and that's an accomplishment, especially coming from young, inexperienced authors on the internet, making up weird little stories, tapping into what it feels like to be scared, what it feels like to be a kid again. Horror should be about self-indulgence, and about not making sense, and about community, and sharing in a creative idea. I wish people understood that you shouldn't make horror corporate or formulaic. Doesn't matter how much money you're gonna make, or how many special effects you have. It's never gonna be the same. And I will say that of course there's good modern horror movies, and maybe they're even beginning to take a new, more experimental turn that will actually be really great for the genre. I love watching horror movies. I even love some of those overused tropes. Like, I love when they use really tall, scary men, like in Gerald's Game, or It Follows, or As Above, So Below. That terrifies me, and it's never gonna get old. Horror is subjective. That's what makes it so cool, and that's what makes creepypastas so fun. I get to see what scares other people who seem more like me, not what some company thinks I would find scary. So I encourage you to go out and read some new scary stories online. You might not find the next great American novel, but you might find something you'll remember. And in the end, that's what's important.